This is Stories from the Hackery, a podcast about the students, alumni, and community members that continue to shape Nashville Software School. Nashville Software School is the nation's first nonprofit coding bootcamp where a person with aptitude and motivation can gain the skills needed for a career in tech. For more information, visit us at nashvillesoftwareschool.com. Welcome back to Stories from the Hackery from Nashville Software School. We have another NSS graduate with us today as we're recording this. It's a beautiful spring morning here in Nashville, and we have Chris Miller with us. Chris is a graduate from a while back, so he was cohort 22 of the full stack web development boot camp. So I didn't look up the date, Chris, but does that mean you graduated? Would that have been 2017 graduation?
I think that sounds right, John. I'd have to look it up myself at this point.
That's got to be ballpark. So about 8 years since you graduated. So Chris has gone, let's just say, well beyond junior status. So, but we're going to catch up today with Chris on some of the background of his journey to where he is now. Several Nashville-based healthcare organizations, but now working for Tubi, the online video streaming company that here most recently got a lot of notice for streaming the Super Bowl, which is a project that Chris was intimately involved in preparing for that. So we'll talk a little bit about the arc of Chris's career and his learning that allowed him to be prepared to work on a project like that. So good morning, Chris. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you with us.
Hi, I'm happy to be here, John. It's good to see you again.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's been a little while. So we always start out by asking everybody to just give us your personal elevator pitch. Who is Chris Miller?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably hard to pigeonhole a person down to just an elevator ride, but for the most part, I grew up as a military kid, so we moved around a lot as a youth, and then I ended up in Louisville, Kentucky for my middle and high school years, and ended up going off to college in Boston, where I got the most pragmatic degree you could possibly get, which is in jazz composition and bass performance.
So typical NSS student.
Yeah, it's at this point not surprising to hear that musicians end up as software developers, because I've gone through that exact that pipeline before, which had a lot of fun until I tried to make any money doing it, and then I needed to find a skill that I could make some money doing that also provided some of the same satisfaction that I got out of music. And I found software development was the perfect combination of fiscally responsible and also doing the thing that I really loved to do, which was collaborating with some people that I really liked, building something that we were pretty passionate about. And going to NSS really provided the foot in the door for me to spend the rest of my life doing this, which I'm eternally grateful for.
Well, that's kind of, it's great to hear. I know enough about, some of your work experience to know that you've been on multiple teams with really good people. So that'll be an interesting thing to talk about. But people that know NSS or who've listened to this podcast know that we talk all the time about the single most reliable predictor of aptitude for software development is are you a musician? Have you been a musician? Have you mastered a musical instrument? Whatever mastery means. But I think one of the things we realized as we got deeper into the NSS journey is it isn't just the cognitive similarities between music and software development. It's the learning similarities that also help musicians, because software developers, because it feels like the learning experience is so similar that it just feels pretty natural to musicians, because it's lots of repetition, it's lots of practice, it's it sounded like crap for a while until you learn how to correct your own mistakes, right? It's being okay with making mistakes because everybody makes them. And I think that, again, that approach to learning that you would have been exposed to as a musician, which then you got re-exposed to at NSS, has probably stood you in good stead here along the way. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So musician before NSS, came to NSS maybe started in 2016, graduated in 2017, or maybe the entire journey was 2017. I can't remember. Left NSS to go to a place that had, I think already had several NSS grads when you went there, right? So tell us a little bit about your pre-Tubi journey in the healthcare world.
Sure. So yeah, you're totally correct. When I left NSS, I got my first job, which was at a local healthcare startup called Aspire, which did palliative care for in-home palliative care. And the team at the time was made up, I think, 75% of NSS grads, which was a truly wonderful experience coming into a place that everybody knew more so than I did, like what I was capable of. I had the best kind of mentorship that you could hope for in that really early stage career of just a lot of people who had gone through the exact same thing that I was currently going through, but 6 months, a year and a half before I did. So they definitely had more knowledge, more perspective, more skill than I had, but were not so far removed that they where that like base level needle of like what they would expect had moved so far beyond where I could have been. It was a really great experience, and I've been lucky to work on teams that I've generally loved, but I could not be more happy to have started my career in that place with that group of people. And just to speak on how much I cared about all those people, I found out just today that one of my colleagues from Aspire got signed onto Tubi. So he'll be starting here at the end of the month.
Cool. Who? Yeah. Can I ask who?
Sure. Anderson Cook, who
I
worked with at Aspire and then again at HCA, and now we'll be coworkers once again here at Tubi.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, speaking of networks and the power of the network, right? So, and a lot of you at Aspire do share that story too, because if I remember right, a bunch of you then went to the place that you went second, right?
Yes. So when the day I started at Aspire was also the day that they officially announced their sale to Anthem, I think, healthcare.
Yeah,
one of the big ones, which is always a fun first day on the job to be like, oh, everything's changing. But I think it's not an uncommon thing to occur after that basically 2 years on the dot after that sale, a lot of people's contracts expired and they were able to leave to start a new company. And they slowly started bringing the dev team over. And I was on that first wave of people they brought over to start greenfielding a new project for CareBridge Health, which is another Nashville-based healthcare startup. And that was a wild transition because I was going to a much smaller dev team that was working on much more disparate things. And I had an experience being basically the sole contributor to the project that I was building, which is a vastly different experience than a whole team working on one monolithic project together.
Right. Yeah, so Aspire, I guess, would have been, by the time you got there, more of a brownfield experience, right? There was an existing app. You're coming in to work on the app. You had to learn the code base, everything. CareBridge was just getting launched, right? So,
yeah, but I think I had to run the generate new project command and got to have that first commit of I don't know, here's the boilerplate that you need.
I'm pretty sure about this part now. What do you want this thing to do?
Yeah. Now I have to figure other stuff out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, cool. So you got to have both of those experiences in the first 3 years on the job, or so. So that's very cool. But with many, if not most, of the same people, right? So you had some continuity in terms of a lot of your teammates and stuff, right?
For sure. Yeah. At day one on the job, I already knew 3 or 4 of the people there. And of the other people there, I think the rest had mostly, once again, come from NSS. Alan Huffman was the CTO of both companies, and he's a big NSS supporter. And
yeah. And did a great job of sort of curating really good teams, I think, in both of those companies, right? Alan's a good guy. So
yeah, I loved working at both those companies, and it was a trip at one point, like working across the desk from him.
yeah. Oh wow, that would be a fire hose.
It was in a lot of different ways.
Yes. Yep. Yeah. All right. Well, that's cool. So then CareBridge, then you've already mentioned then that I think HCA was the next. So another,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, yeah, I moving from Aspire to CareBridge was a really tough decision because I was leaving behind a lot of people that I really enjoyed working with and respected and thought of as my mentors. But it was in a lot of ways, a seamless transition to like kind of working with the same group of people on a very similar project. And then it turns out that a lot of the rest of the team would trickle over time. My choice to move to HCA was a much harder decision because I was leaving behind a lot of these people. But I had met my future boss, Brian Hunter, when he was driving me home from a tech conference once. We were both at a conference, I think, in Chattanooga or Knoxville, and he just so happened to be driving back to Nashville, and I hitched a ride with him, and I got to listen to Brian talk for 2 hours about technology and life and art and movies. And
yeah, and you didn't get a word in it. You didn't get a word in edgewise for 2 hours, right?
Of course not. And then for another couple of years after that. But
sorry, Brian. For those of you who don't, Brian Hunter is a great guy, a very deep professional software engineer, but also pretty diverse range of interests and strong opinions about me. But just a great guy. So
truly a wonderful human.
So you went from the Alan Huffman experience at 2 companies to the Brian Hunter experience at HCA, which is that's pretty wild. So
it was wild, and it was a very different experience, both team wise and technology decision making wise, and I got to see how they're both like very reasonable approaches in very different settings. It was I feel truly lucky that I have had only positive work experiences in a field where I know that's not always the case for everybody.
Sure. It's not. Not every startup is as successful as the 2 you work for, not every team. Yeah, you've had some good fortune to fall in with good people. So now, tell me a little bit about the nature of the work were you pretty much doing full stack work at Aspire and CareBridge, or were you more biased server side, front end? I mean, kind of what was the mix of things that you were doing technically?
Sure. So Aspire was definitely full stack application. We built a application for nurses who were going into homes to do care assessments. So it was a lot of, here's a big form that you have to fill out. You need to be able to assign tasks to different parts of care teams. And all of us were working on vertical features. So build the database, the server side, the front end, connect it all, put it in the app, test it, send it out into the field, and then take the emails from the nurses and fix the things that you broke. When I moved to CareBridge, it was definitely more of a back-end specific development and a little bit more of like an integration piece because CareBridge had bought a handful of disparate companies that did similar things. They built their own product that did another similar thing, and they were trying to combine all of these platforms into like one unified experience. So in that role, I was doing solely back-end development. There was a single front-end dev that had been assigned to this project who was building like a mobile app to go with it, but that was all back-end. And then moving to HCA, there wasn't even a front end for the product at all. We were just a big integration engine for all of the HCA hospital facility medical data. So it was, I can't remember exactly. I think it was roughly 20 million messages a day that we had to ingest and process and send out to hundreds of different external companies. So it was a much different scale to get thrown into, from these kind of like
Right.
internal apps to this just like, here's a big data engine that you have to stream through data in near real time.
Yeah, so much more of a data engineering job then, not just back end, but a lot of ingestion and then distribution of data. So
Yeah, it was, in a lot of ways, it was like building an app that the company could use for ETL purposes, for like complex data analysis. So a lot of the things that our platform was enabling was somebody with deep medical knowledge would want to try and alert nurses on the floor if a patient was in like a pre-septic state. So we would look through all of their medical records as they were coming in real time. We would try and detect the precursors for sepsis and then send out alerts to the people closest to this patient so that we could try and preemptively treat them.
right, try to mitigate what was maybe coming. Okay. All
Those
right,
are the
so-
much more interesting use cases than the ones that were like, we want to turn the AC down in this room when there's nobody in it. It's like, okay, yeah, that's practical, but it's not as much fun to think about.
Yeah, right. It's kind of, saving somebody from sepsis is a lot more,
Yeah.
interesting to think about than let's save a few pennies on air conditioning.
Yeah, one of the last projects that we were working on before I left was programming auto IV pumps, which is, I believe, like the most high pressure thing that I will ever work on. It's a machine hooked up to a human being's body that's going to like distribute some amount of drugs based on how you program this thing. And it's like,
Don't want to mess that one up.
no, the margin of error is basically zero. You can't do anything wrong there.
Yep. So much greater scale, much greater consequences of errors, whatever, in the work. So, very much another sort of step up career wise in terms of consequences, impact, scale. And if you're working with Brian, probably technologies you were working with too. So,
For sure.
which sounds like it was probably then another good step in your learning journey to prepare you for then the project that we really wanted to talk about, which is what you did at Tubi this last year, because they were, for the first time, going to stream the Super Bowl, which is, I think, the single highest volume, right, one day or few hour thing that happens on video, on TV, whatever TV is these days. So, tell us a little bit there, because I think, that you're purely in a back end or server side role at Tubi. So tell us a little bit about kind of what you were doing at Tubi that sort of sets you up to be, oops. Let's scale this. Let's scale this thing a couple orders of magnitude.
Yeah, sure. Well, I started at Tubi roughly around 2 years ago, so that spring-ish 2023. And the first project that I worked on was, we call it the electronic programming guide. It's basically like the TV guide screen. So
Right.
it was a lot of things that I was pretty familiar with. It was a lot of data ingestion from third parties, because all of these individual channels publish their schedules. So we have to ingest that data, ETL it. And it was a lot of just build an app that services these things. But also during that time, as I was just getting up to speed on the whole Tubi technological ecosystem, you, John, have taught me to ask a lot of questions about all of these things. So as I was learning how the whole Tubi system works, I would ask, why does this alert go off every day at this time? And people would say, I don't know, but it doesn't change anything. And I'd be the person who, just trying to figure out how it's all connected, would be like, well, I think these Nginx persistent connections are resetting on a cadence. And if we could change this configuration to make the HTTP polling last longer, we can get rid of it. And I would do it, and everybody would be like, oh, cool. The alert that didn't do anything now doesn't go off anymore. And I was like, okay, sure. But I think it was those kinds of investigations into things that are at a much weirder part of the technology stack than people have a tendency to be interested in. When the Tubi got the opportunity to stream the Super Bowl, they were like, who's that guy who likes to do weird stuff? And looked at me over in my corner just trying to trace packets, and they were like, I don't know. He might not know anything about CDNs, but he'll learn.
Okay. Well, so let's sort of talk about that, because I read some numbers that I think you shared, or maybe somebody found. I mean, the magnitude of the increase in scale that you guys would have to process for that relatively brief window to stream the Super Bowl, compared to what the highest volume thing that Tubi had streamed before was, I mean, it's huge. Give us an idea of the magnitude of the scaling effort.
Sure. I think one of the things that's easiest to think about is I maintain one of the services that delivers the response to build the home screen. So if you go to Tubi or Netflix or any of these streaming services, you get a home screen that's just a big grid of suggestions to watch. So one of my services builds that big JSON payload of here's the stuff to render the home screen and a bunch of video options. Generally speaking, that service gets, I think, at peak 10,000 requests per second, which is really pretty sizable. And especially since these responses can be up to 2 megabytes large, it's a lot of data being slung around all the time.
Yep.
During the peak of the Super Bowl, that service, which normally got 10,000 requests per second, we were serving, I believe, 250,000 requests per second. So, it was an amount of scaling that our service just could not handle. And it would take basically rewriting the entire service and all of the infrastructure around it to be able to handle that amount of scale, even just for the 4 hours that we needed to manage it. So we had to come up with a different solution.
Okay. So, which I'm guessing involved a whole lot of stuff that you hadn't had to deal with before, right? So this is sort of peak learning. And I know one of the things that you said in a message you shared with NSS is this really tapped deeply into what one of our mantras for our students at NSS is learning to learn, right? That you need to learn because it's what you're going to do your whole career. Now, I kind of alluded to the fact that I think musicians tend to bring that with them to NSS. So, but we certainly hammer on it some. And it sounds like your progression of your career provided you with lots of opportunities to continue to learn. Certainly any amount of time with Brian Hunter, you're going to get challenged to learn, for example, but also bigger scale than you dealt with before, different kinds of apps. So it sounds like you'd had some steps, but talk to me a little bit about just the learning, the learning, or how you approach this. Oh my God, we're going to have to deal with like a 25x or whatever it is scaling challenge, and we can't rewrite everything. So what do we have to figure out to even know how to tackle this?
Yeah. Before I move too far into the actual Super Bowl project, I do want to just talk a little bit about my thoughts on where musicianship and software development overlap, because it's a thing that I've spent basically the last 8 years of my life thinking about nonstop because it's what I do every day. But and it's funny. I think the first time I talked to you, we talked about this. And in my original NSS interview, I had mentioned being a musician, and we had the same discussion. And I totally agree. I think that the brain physiological similarities is like a novel thing. And I am sure that the scientists who've done this research are correct in the understanding that there are a lot of deep brain overlaps between these things. But I give all of my credit in my success in pretty much every endeavor in my life into just the fact that as a kid, I had to learn how to practice something. And I think there's a lot of things that go into that, just the discipline, like the consistency. But I think the thing that a lot of people never have the opportunity to learn is the fact that like everybody can progress at anything. I think it is a really existentially dreadful thing at times to like look at where you are today and look at where somebody else is today and see that gap and not know how you can ever get to where they are. And being a musician or, any kind of visual artist, a writer, anything that just takes time and effort, like you learn this idea of like, yeah, every day I take a step forward and they also take a step forward and everybody's progressing at different rates. But the people who are at the best, your favorite musician, your favorite whatever, they also started somewhere else and they've had to progress in their career and their skill and their craft. And I think I talked to a lot of people who are just like, oh, I don't think I could ever do that. And I was like, well, I just don't think you've ever learned that you can. And I think I think the skill that I intrinsically learned as a musician and going through NSS realized that is the one thing that I've learned that has helped me the most is just this idea that like, yeah, I'm terrible at this thing today, but that's okay. It's because everybody was terrible at this one thing at some point.
Right. I'll be less terrible tomorrow.
I'll be less terrible tomorrow. And at some point, somebody will look at me and be like, oh, wow, I wish I was as good as they were.
Right.
And, it's really hard to keep your own skill and perspective in that, which is one of the reasons why I really like continuing to mentor NSS students as they go through the program. Because not only do I remember how much I appreciated having somebody around as I was going through the program, but it's a good reminder of where I am to see, oh, I remember trying to type anything into the command line for the first time. And now as I'm like patting somebody on the back and saying, you don't have to understand this, but just type out these letters and we'll get through this. It's just it's a good level setting. And I think it's important to remember that wherever you are, you've come really far and you've still got a long way to go.
Yeah. Well, that whole, again, the idea of having a growth mindset, right? Some of what you just said sort of relates to the concept of a growth mindset. It relates to learning to learn. It relates to, look, it's just repetition. It's practice. It's repetition. But being conscious of it, right? Being aware that this is a process. It's not an event. I don't learn Python as an event. I learn Python as a process, right? And it's processes inside of processes inside of processes, and you just keep moving forward. I love that summary you just had though about the mindset that you had and you have, and you obviously continue to have, right? And I like to think that that's probably an integral reason why you've had some of these career opportunities that you've had, is because the people that you work with know that, hey, we can hit Chris with something he ain't ever seen before, and he's going to buckle down and figure it out. And
yeah, it's also lucky that none of us have to do these things in a vacuum. We exist in a world and a community that is more than happy to share this information. Especially talking about the Super Bowl project, all the things that I learned, I had to learn from somebody else. These are the deep inner workings of how a CDN network terminates TLS and then routes a request to a particular machine that services it via a particular configuration. Turns out those were things that I had to have a pretty deep knowledge of and had no idea of how they worked. And I had to find somebody who built them at AWS and ask them, like, how do these work? And they would tell me.
Right. So you didn't have to just chase down the experts in your company. You might have had to search outside of Tubi to find the people at the next level down in the stack, maybe, who really understood how these things work. So an expert at AWS or an expert at, your CDN provider. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I had to spend a lot of time with them. Turns out that all of the complexities of building something that's designed to like hyperscale, you really have to really understand every piece of it. And the final artifact in and of itself is not like that complicated, but every decision had to be made with the most amount of knowledge, because you had to say, can this serve 500,000 requests per second, which deliver 1.2 terabits of data per second over the network? You got to make sure that all the pieces are put together as best they can.
Yeah. Well, that's a great insight, because at that level of scale, you can't miss a trick, right? Every layer in the stack has to be optimized correctly, and in a way that flows seamlessly, kind of top to bottom, right? If you miss a trick at one layer, you bottleneck the whole thing, right? So figuring that out, and most of us who spend our lives at the application layer, at the top layer or so, and interacting with the things at the one layer down or two, we usually don't have to optimize that deeply, right? Because our hardware is so powerful, our networks are so fast, despite the fact that we find ever increasing ways to waste all that power every time it increases. Not many of us ever ever get confronted with an application problem like you had, where it's got to be tied together top to bottom.
Yeah, it's tough. It's very true that like the problems that I've faced in my career are problems that not everybody will face, just like the problems that anybody faces are unique to them. I have consistently found that a willingness to continue to dig in is almost always beneficial, even if you don't inherently solve the problem you're facing with at that day. Maybe the next day, you'll just have a little bit more comfortability. One example from the Super Bowl project is we were dealing with 2 different CDN vendors so that we could have redundancy in case of outages. And we would see a slightly different performance across these 2 vendors. So I ended up having to do like network packet capturing to generate enough data to provide to our CDN vendor to say like, hey, in between the SSL handshake and the first data packet delivered, there's a 200 millisecond gap here. Why is this happening? And by providing that analysis, there was no way for anybody to say, I don't think this is happening. Here's data that shows there's a 200 millisecond gap. What's happening? Why is this happening?
Right.
I have no idea I don't know much about TLS. I don't know what those packets mean in context of what I'm trying to do, which is deliver some JSON data. But the fact that I at least knew that I could get Wireshark up and running and do some packet captures helped me get to the point where their networking engineers could get involved and say, oh yeah, there's a crypto server is running low on CPU resources. We can bump that up. It's like, sure, great. I don't know what that means, but I'm glad.
But it sounds like a good thing. Let's do it.
Yes. Yeah. Now our graphs look flat again. Thank you.
Okay. Well, so I love that. It's just digging in, asking questions, bringing some data. That's always important, right? Don't just ask in a vacuum. Bring me some data. Yeah. Show me you researched it, which then helps me focus on how I can help you, right? So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I found is even if something is drastically out of my comfort zone, it's generally not any more complex than the things I'm normally dealing with. It's a different type of complexity, and it might be some additional context that I definitely don't have, like with how the inner workings of the TCP protocol. But, if you get enough context, which you can normally do through 1 or 2 blogs, you can get enough to start digging in. You don't have to know C to be able to read through some C code to be like, I just need to know how they're implementing this one thing. I don't need to know the rest of it, but I can read code. It's fine if I squint.
Yeah. If the light hits it just right, I can interpret that because
it was also just written by somebody doing their best, and they were not. I think Steve always said, knowledge is a Venn diagram. Nobody's circle encompasses your circle entirely.
Yep, that's right.
We all have different sets of knowledge, and you can get a little bit from somebody else's.
Well, that's right. Which then moves your circle a little bit, right? And it just inches out. But you're never going to encompass it all, so don't and you don't need to, because you can, as you've demonstrated, you can learn it when the time comes if you do need it.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned a number of things, but so I'm just going to ask you sort of an umbrella question. Now that it's over and you can look at it in the rearview mirror a little bit, what were your biggest kind of takeaways or lessons learned from the scaling project, the Super Bowl project?
I think I learned a couple things. One, this was kind of my first foray into architecting a solution and then relying on other people to implement parts of it, which turns out people are hard. And that's, anytime you get pushed into more managerial roles, those problems are way different than technology problems. And it made me realize that I've got I'm just learning how much more growth exists in these careers. But on the technology side, we had a pretty short timeline with a deadline that, while was not an IV pump attached to a human, it was very important for the company that this go well. So It was a pretty high stakes project in context of being employed by this company. Yeah.
Well, there was no shifting the date. I mean, it was going to happen. No. Right.
It was going to happen. And it was really just a lot about how do you build a roadmap when you don't know exactly where the end of that road's going to look like. But you have to start building, you have to start laying pavement as you go, but you have to be able to iterate fast. You have to be able to test as you go. A lot of the things that we were concerned about was, since scale was our number one goalpost, how do you do large scale distributed load tests on these things so that we can make sure that our changes don't affect that? How do we, so it was a lot of building infrastructure so that we could test the infrastructure that we needed to build. It was a lot of making sure that our cache usage was always correct, because you can't scale if you're not caching correctly. It was a lot of observability. It was so much.
Yeah.
You know, the probably, I would say 40% of my time was implementing the solution, and 60% of the time was implementing things that made sure that that solution didn't break as we continued to work on it. So to let you test and validate the solution was working the way you intended. Yes, I'm very used to writing software tests, which are pretty easy in comparison to all right, we have to build a suite of applications to test this one thing. And we want to run it from everywhere in the United States because that's how the traffic is going to look. And
it
was it's just a lot of building things to maintain confidence. I think at the end of the day, because the end of the day was 40 of us sitting in a room at the Fox Broadcast Center watching hundreds of graphs and a big TV showing the Super Bowl, that the most important thing was that we felt confident, because it was if we didn't know how to operate the system, it would have been a pretty chaotic day.
Yeah, I imagine so. Well, let me shift gears on you for a minute, Chris, because one thing we've been talking to everybody about the last few months in our podcast, at least the last few months, is some of the changes that are going on in our profession, right? Related to specifically generative AI, so large language models, the mantra from the people with a vested interest in these things saying, shoot all your programmers because it's all going to get generated automatically. Oh, shit. Yeah, that's not good. Two, increasingly, now that we've got a couple years of experience under our belt using these things, or 2.5, increasingly people saying, not so fast, right? That's just, no. Maybe it's going to supplement us. Maybe it's going to augment us. Maybe it's going to improve our productivity. Maybe we'll be writing less code manually, but you're not eliminating software engineers. And in fact, thinking that it will eliminate software engineers based on anything we see today is relates to a fundamental misunderstanding of what software engineers even do, right? So, I'm in fact working on a blog post on this. We've sort of done. We did some research the last 2 years. We surveyed all of our grads. What are you guys doing with it, right? And I think we got some comments back from you last year. I think expressing some skepticism is probably the right word about this stuff in the context of what you'd experienced or seen. So we're not going to do another survey this spring because I think the votes are in. We're going to be using these tools, but we're also not going to get replaced by these tools anytime. At least that's our feeling. So I wanted to sort of ask you expressed skepticism a year ago. Kind of where are you now on generative AI tools as a productivity aid, as another tool in your toolbox, right? How are you feeling about those now? And where are you using them, or where are you able to use them today?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely am generally on the, I believe, skeptical side for a number of different reasons, and ranging from the very practical, I don't think these give me the right answer all the time, to the wildly socio-political, I don't want these companies trying to replace me just by extracting value out of machines that you're paid too much for already. We can avoid that side of my more conspiratorial ranting about it. But as far as their day-to-day usefulness, I think they're a tool. And like all tools, they have value in some applications. And it's an interesting time as these tools do get drastically better all the time. I think we are still in a place, though, where these tools are not, I think the value that they're promoted as is not necessarily the value that they inherently have currently.
Okay.
And I think that that's problematic in our industry, where a lot of people have jobs where they feel a lot of pressure to produce something, and they will reach for something that helps them produce that thing. And if the thing that it produces is not great, it can create a bad cycle. And I've experienced working with really high impact software where I would shudder to think that anybody would use code that wasn't meticulously thought about. If you're working on a hospital integration engine, if you're working in some sort of financial infrastructure, these are things where you really don't want to mess up. And any code that's generated by an LLM, I'm going to be skeptical that it does the right thing. But outside of those kinds of pretty high level things, I have some more general skepticism on just the idea of LLMs in general. And I think one of the things that I'm skeptical about is that it's reducing our ability to curate our own information. Throughout human history, we've built tools that do a better job of giving humans information. And we expected the human to use those resources and decide what they found value in. Printing presses led to libraries, the internet led to search engines. All of that probably inherently biased us towards some information over others, but it was still, at the end of the day, like our responsibility to go in and look at a bunch of disparate sources and say, I'm going to choose this one. And a human's probably still pretty bad at choosing the right one, but at least there's some decision going into that. With LLMs, you're kind of reducing all of that curation ability to just say, you asked a question, and now I'm not even giving you 10 links. I'm just giving you a response that was generated on something. So you do with that what you will is a thing that I find a little concerning, especially since they're not deterministic. So if you ask the same question a bunch of different times, you'll get a bunch of different answers, but how do you evaluate which of those different answers is the best one? The other thing that I think is really concerning about modern LLM usage is, this is maybe a wild comparison, but like the information we're losing through like LLM decompression and compression. If I ask ChatGPT to write an email to somebody and then their Siri generates an AI summary of that email, like how much of the original information is still in there? And I'm just concerned that that's what everybody's going to be doing, is just generating a lot of text from a small idea that then gets re-summarized into a small amount of data because nobody actually wants to read the 2-page email that ChatGPT generated. What's the lossless compression ratio on that?
Yeah, interesting. Because, I mean, just information theory will tell you that there's definitely some loss there, right?
Yeah, so, entropy happens, and there's no way to preserve it. So, and then we're just spending a lot of computer cycles to do it for us. So it's just like, well, why? What's the value?
Yeah. Well, and your point about it's the way LLMs work as a probability engine, right? They're making everything's getting more homogeneous, right? The answers sound more and more and more alike. They're based on what are the most frequent things that was in my training data. So very subject to bias based on, what was in my training data, right? Mm-hmm. It's not like going deep in the stacks, researching a subject at a library where you're pulling out some wild stuff from people that may not be the accepted wisdom today, but it's fairly common in a lot of fields for that person that got forgotten about to cycle back as more knowledge accumulates and people realize, oh, dude had a point, right?
Yeah.
And we rethink a whole subfield of knowledge. I don't know how that happens, right? If we start putting the LLMs between us, and unless we throw all this shit in the training data, but I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. So
no,
yeah, I think there's just lots of concerns, lots of issues there, and
there is. But at the same time, I have to continuously check myself to think. I write a high-level language. It's as far removed from ones and zeros as you possibly can be as a software developer at this point. I rely on any number of tools in between me and the actual machine running these codes to do their jobs, and I don't need to know how those function.
Right.
So the idea that you could further abstract like that language to more normal human language, sure, it sounds great. The important thing is that like we can describe the system we need, and then tools will generate the code that the machine needs. So I get the goal and like the design and the approach, and I think those are all really valid. I just think that LLMs were not designed for those purposes. And specifically, like LLMs are not trained for those things. They're trained to make the prompter happy. The only real feedback that an LLM gets is, do you think this sounds correct? Sure, it's not I've worked with data scientists who were doing medical analysis, trying to detect sepsis or those kinds of things. And those are very finite regression models where you can easily say, does this pattern meet
Right.
the criteria? And it's a very binary option. But with
Right.
these language models are just trained on, I don't know, does a human give it a thumbs up? Like there's no other real feedback that you can give other than just, does the person on the other end feel good about it? It's not about being correct or like delivering good data. It's just, I don't know, did the recipient think the answer was good?
Yeah. Well, and it's why when we start talking about generating code, it's why we can't just take the generated code and assume it's right, which is different than the output of the compiler or interpreter for Python or something, where that's a deterministic thing.
Yeah.
And all of the layers of abstraction we've added. I mean, I started out writing assembler language code. And so still a layer above the ones and zeros, right? But then quickly got, it's COBOL and Fortran. So a couple layers above. And we've inserted so many other layers into the stack in the meantime, in the 50 years since. But again, it's always been deterministic up to this stage. Now we are creating a level of abstraction that's non-deterministic, which means we can't trust them.
Yeah.
It's certainly at this stage we can't. So we have to validate. But it also means all of this focus on the writing of the code. You made the point, I think, in some of the prep for this. You made the point that one of the hardest points of software development is not writing code until you know exactly what the solution should be, right? And it's
Yes. One of my favorite tech speakers, Chris Keithley, who's another Elixir developer who I've always really appreciated his opinions on, once drew out the food pyramid of what our responsibilities are as a software developer. And the first 90% of the pyramid was, do you understand the problem? Strictly just like, do you know what the thing you're building is supposed to do? And then like 80% of the next one was, do you really understand how this fits into the larger system that you're working in?
Well, right.
And then of that last like 2% or wherever we're at is just, did you write code that does what that other 98% said you should do? The code part is such a small part of my day-to-day job. And I get that I'm working in applications that already exist. If I had to greenfield an application every day, I'd probably love LLMs. But in my job, like, the thing that I need to do is understand and not write a bunch of code that does stuff. We have a suite of 30 or 40 microservices that are all interacting in a complicated dependency graph to deliver data to our customers. And I have to know a lot about that graph to understand that a change to this service is going to make to every other service. So,
Right.
it might take me 3 days to write a couple lines of code, but I need to make sure that I understand how that affects the entire system.
Right. Well, kind of coming back to the boot camp. So based on what you've experienced with these LLMs and stuff, and observing sort of the state of play in our industry and things, what would you say we should be doing at the boot camp level, trying to get people into the career, trying to get them qualified to go on the job, be productive relatively quickly and not screw too many things up in the process? How should we be approaching the learning process for our students, right? How should we be injecting these things into their learning journey?
Yeah, that's, as somebody who's not an educator, it's a tough problem for me. I think just like the way that Stack Overflow did for a generation before, I think LLMs are doing for us now, which is you kind of have to devoid yourself from like where code comes from. And you have to really focus on like the understanding of what the problem is and how this supports a solution. People will use LLMs to generate code. I am sure a bunch of the PRs that I review every day contain more or less generated code in them. And I don't mind. It doesn't matter if somebody copied something out of Stack Overflow or got it from a blog post, they wrote it themselves, they had it generated for them. But what is important is that the person who wrote the code understood what their intent was and how this code supports that intent. And I think that's something that anybody can focus on, whether they're going through a boot camp or they've been in the industry for 30 years, is just, what is this problem we're trying to solve? And how does this work for that solution?
Right. Does this actually, is this fit for purpose? Does it actually do? Right. Right. Do I understand how it fits? Your point about how does it fit into this bigger thing that it's going to be integrated into, and does it break it, or does it do what I wanted it to do? So
yeah, or does it do what I wanted it to do, but does it do it in 200 lines of code when you could have done it in 2 lines of code? Is it
right
optimized versus not? There's so much that goes into any problem that just it's just all about understanding, I guess, which is such a trite way to say it, especially when you're trying to teach people how to understand what computers do, that it's probably not the most productive way to just be like, well, just understand.
Just understand.
Yeah, just get it.
Yeah. Let me know when you understand it. Come on back and let me know. Yeah, right.
Yes. But I've seen it from myself, definitely from a lot of people I've helped go through NSS, that often you think that the artifact of code is what's important at the end of the day. But that is, A, it's software. It's designed to be transient. And B, nobody writes us by line of code, or nobody pays us per line of code. They pay us to provide value. And that value is almost never just software. It's a product for a company, or it's a solution to a problem. Those are the things that are important. And I think that we're very far from LLMs being a valid solution to those things. So if they help somebody get to that, that's great. I just don't think we can rely on them as the sole source for that particular side of what a software developer is supposed to spend their day doing.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you for sharing that. And we're at about an hour, so probably need to bring this home here. So you've been very generous with your time. Chris, really appreciate you coming on and sharing your story with us. It's great to, it's great to see somebody who went to the boot camp as long ago as you did, and sort of see that the career arc that you've been able to trace since then, and the learning journey associated with that it's very cool. So I've got 2 exit questions, I guess. One is my, standard absolute last question, exit question. But before I get to that one, any last thoughts that you have that you want to share relative to, the kinds of things we've talked about your journey, about learning, about any of these things, before I ask you what your technology guilty pleasure is?
Yeah, no, I think I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and over the many years that I've been doing this, that there is so little of this whole world of technology that is truly outside of a normal person's grasp. There are, I am sure, I've looked into algorithms that I don't understand, and I'm sure if I looked at too deep into the Linux kernel, there are some bits that I would never want to get to. But every time I open up a dark cupboard, I find that it's different than what I'm familiar with, but it's not outside of the realm of understanding. These are all things that were built by just normal people doing their jobs. And if somebody asks you a question and you can't find the answer, the answer's maybe just a little deeper, and you can find it somewhere.
Yeah. Excellent. That's a great closing thought. Thank you. All right. So what is your technology guilty pleasure, Chris Miller?
The one that probably irritates my colleagues the most is my insistence on continuing to use Vim, which I blame fully on Aspire and 3 other devs that came out of the NSS program, who were the 3 people that I sat next to, and they were all using Vim. So as I had to learn React and Elixir for the very first time, If I also didn't learn Vim, I would have had no idea what they were doing.
So to allow you to snoop on what they were doing, you had to learn Vim for...
Yeah. As I was sitting next to Adam Oswalt, just watching him do what he did, I had to learn the language and the tooling at the same time.
Okay. And now you're stuck with it. Okay.
And now I have no desire to learn something else when, Vim works.
Yeah. When your fingers do what you want them to do without you even thinking about it, right? Yeah. Who needs another editor?
Yes.
I got this one.
My 1 second pitch is I've seen people who are way better at VS Code than I will ever be at Vim. But when I occasionally have to SSH into a remote machine, I'm prepared. I'm the person that everybody calls to be like, we need to update this cert file on this weird dev machine. I'm just like, guys, I got it.
Got it, guys.
I know how to do this.
Okay. All right, Chris. Well, Chris, again, thank you so much for coming on Story from the Hackery and sharing some of your story. It's great to hear. It's great to see you again. It's been a while. So
It has been, and it's great to see you. And it's good to be able to tell you in person, thank you so much for NSS. It's not only changed my life in many incredible ways, but like the number of people in my life who's also benefited from going through NSS is just continuing to grow. My brother-in-law went through NSS. One of our best friends just finished up the program, and
oh, cool.
It's always great to just see that it's still changing lives.
Well, it's great to be able to continue to do it because, and you're welcome, but what makes it worthwhile doing, I think for all of us at NSS, is the stories like yours and the people and the people in your family and the people that were in your class. It ultimately, it all comes back around to the people, right? And to be able to help people, hopefully most of them find a career that is obviously rewarding and enriching for them, as I think yours obviously seems to have been for you. That is very cool. It is very cool. So, and that's why, again, getting a chance to kind of visit with folks who've been through it and are partway down their path is again it's so enjoyable to just, oh man, that's cool. So, all right. Well, Chris, thank you. And that takes care of another episode of Stories from the Hackery. If you'd like more stories like this, please visit us at NashvilleSoftwareSchool.com.